Arabella thought James only broke her heart. What she didn't know was that a dark-eyed duke had already begun destroying the man who betrayed her, piece by piece, from the shadows. The night before her world collapsed, Arabella Braxton dreamed of orange blossoms. She woke to the smell of rain and the sound of her mother weeping in the drawing room below. It was the weeping that told her everything, not the loud, dramatic sobbing that accompanied minor tragedies like a ruined hem or a declined invitation, but the quiet, hollow kind that came from somewhere deeper than disappointment. The kind that meant something had broken beyond repair. Arabella knew, even before she descended the stairs in her dressing gown, even before she saw the morning paper crumpled on the floor, even before her father's grey face turned toward her with an expression of such profound pity that it made her stomach turn. She knew. James Kingswell had married someone else. Not just someone else. Her best friend. Vivienne Sterling, whose father had died 3 months ago and left her a fortune that everyone said was obscene for an unmarried girl to inherit. Vivienne, who had sat in this very drawing room just 2 weeks ago, holding Arabella's hand and promising that nothing would ever come between them. Vivienne, who knew. Who had always known how Arabella felt about James. The announcement in *The Morning Chronicle* was brief, almost brutal in its efficiency. Mr. James Kingswell of Berkshire to Miss Vivienne Sterling of London, married by special license on the 14th of November, 1851, at St. George's Chapel. Yesterday. They'd married yesterday, while Arabella had been choosing fabric for what she'd foolishly imagined would be her own wedding dress. "I'm so sorry, darling," her mother whispered, but Arabella couldn't bear the weight of that sympathy. She walked past her parents, past the newspaper, past the ruins of every assumption she'd built her life upon, and locked herself in her room. She didn't cry. That was the strange part. She felt hollowed out, certainly, scraped clean of whatever naive thing she'd been just hours before. But tears seemed too small for this. Too ordinary. What she felt was bigger and colder and infinitely more clarifying. James Kingswell had courted her for 8 months. 8 months of walks in Hyde Park, of dances where his hand lingered at her waist, of conversations that stretched long into evenings while her mother played chaperone from a discreet distance. 8 months of carefully constructed hope, of whispered maybes and almosts. And then Vivienne's father had died, and suddenly James couldn't seem to remember Arabella's address. The cruelest part? She'd made excuses for him. When he cancelled their engagement, she'd told herself he was simply busy. When he stopped calling, she'd convinced herself he was being respectful of her family's modest circumstances, waiting for the right moment. She'd been so determined to believe in him that she'd ignored every warning sign, every cooling gesture, every transparent excuse. She'd been a fool. But she would not be a fool again. The social death that followed was slower and more painful than Arabella had imagined. London society didn't ostracize the Braxton family openly. That would have been too kind, too clean. Instead, they were subjected to something worse, pity. Pitying glances across ballrooms. Pitying whispers behind fans. Pitying smiles from women who had never liked Arabella much anyway and were now vindicated in their assessment of her as unremarkable. The invitations dried up like flowers in winter. The Kingswell family, now allied with the Sterling fortune, had considerable influence, and people made their calculations accordingly. The Braxtons, after all, were only in trade. Arabella's father was a textile merchant, successful, certainly, but not titled, not landed, not truly *one of them star. They'd been tolerated when it seemed James Kingswell might marry Arabella and bridge that gap. Now that he hadn't, well, the natural order had reasserted itself. Arabella's younger sisters, Cordelia and Margot, bore the brunt of it at their academy. They came home with stories of girls who'd once been friends suddenly finding reasons to sit elsewhere, to partner with others for lessons, to whisper and laugh when they passed. Her mother stopped hosting her weekly at-homes when it became clear no one would attend. Her father grew quiet and tired, watching his social climbing ambitions crumble while his business remained steady but socially insufficient. It was at a small gathering in February, one of the few invitations they still received, from an elderly cousin who felt obligated, that Arabella first saw him. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashford, was not a man who entered a room quietly. It wasn't his height, though he was tall. It wasn't his looks, though he was handsome in a severe, dark-eyed way that made him look perpetually dissatisfied with the world. It was something else. A kind of concentrated intensity, as if he saw more than other people and found most of it disappointing. He'd been abroad for years, someone whispered. India, primarily, but also Egypt and Persia. Something about railways and mining investments. Something about a scandal, though no one seemed to know what kind. He'd only returned to London 2 months ago when his father died and left him one of the largest fortunes in England. Arabella watched him move through the room with the detached interest of someone who'd learned not to hope for much. He was introduced to the eligible young ladies with their fresh faces and their practiced laughs, and he looked bored to the point of rudeness. She found that oddly refreshing. Then his eyes found hers. It was not a romantic moment. There was no spark, no instant recognition of souls. Instead, he looked at her with the same intensity he'd looked at everything else, except this time he seemed to find something worth examining. Before she could look away, he was crossing the room toward her. "You Miss Braxton," he said. It wasn't a question. "Your Grace." She curtsied, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm surprised you know my name. I make it my business to know things." He studied her with those dark, unnerving eyes. "You're the textile merchant's daughter. The one everyone's been gossiping about." Heat flooded her cheeks. How flattering to be so noteworthy. "I didn't say the gossip was interesting," he replied. "Just that it exists. People love to talk about disappointments. It makes them feel better about their own mediocre lives." Arabella blinked. She'd expected pity or curiosity, perhaps even cruelty. She hadn't expected blunt honesty delivered with such complete disinterest in her feelings about it. "You're remarkably direct, Your Grace. I've been told I lack social graces. Years abroad will do that." He paused. "I've also been told you're intelligent, well-read, and far too good for the fool who married the sterling fortune. People have been remarkably generous with their opinions about my situation." "Not generous. Accurate." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to speak with your father about a business matter. Would you arrange an introduction?" She stared at him. "My father? The Duke of Ashford wants to discuss business with a textile merchant." "I want to discuss business with a successful textile merchant who has contacts in Manchester and Birmingham that I need. His title, or lack thereof, is irrelevant to me." He waited. "Will you introduce us, or shall I be forced to track him down myself like some sort of common stalker?" Despite herself, Arabella almost smiled. "That would be terribly scandalous, Your Grace. I've survived worse scandals." She introduced them. Her father, surprised and clearly overwhelmed, stammered his way through a conversation about cotton imports and manufacturing processes while the Duke listened with focused attention and asked pointed, knowledgeable questions. Arabella stood nearby, nominally chaperoned but effectively invisible, and watched Alexander Blackwood transform from a bored aristocrat into something else entirely, a sharp, strategic mind that saw angles and opportunities where others saw only cloth and commerce. When they parted, the Duke turned to her. "I'll call on your father Thursday afternoon to continue this discussion. I trust you'll be present, Miss Braxton." You seem the sort to understand the details that men often overlook. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. And somehow, Arabella found she didn't mind. He came Thursday. And the following Tuesday. And again on Friday. Each time, ostensibly to discuss business with her father, though Arabella noticed that his questions increasingly turned toward her. What did she think of the new steam-powered looms? Had she read about the labor disputes in the northern mills? What was her opinion on the quality of Egyptian cotton versus Indian? Her father, no fool despite his wounded social ambitions, saw what was happening and quietly allowed it. The Duke of Ashford's interest in his daughter, whether professional or personal, was not something to be discouraged. But Arabella was cautious. She'd been burned once by hope, and she wouldn't be burned again. When Alexander asked if she'd walk with him in Hyde Park, she agreed but brought Cordelia as chaperone. When he invited her family to the theatre, she accepted but kept her conversation polite and distant. When he began appearing at every small social function the Braxtons attended, functions that suddenly seemed to attract better crowds than they had in months, she noticed but said nothing. "You don't trust me," he said one afternoon in May. They were in her father's study, ostensibly reviewing contracts for a new manufacturing partnership. Her father had been called away, leaving them alone but for the open door and the servants nearby. "I don't know you, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected. "And you know me better than most people in this city. You've listened to me talk for 3 months. You've argued with me about labor practices, disagreed with my assessment of tariff policies, and called my investment in that Sheffield steel mill romantically impractical. You know exactly who I am. I know what you've chosen to show me. Which is everything." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't perform, Miss Braxton. I don't have the patience for it. What you see is what exists. Then what I see is a duke who's using business with my father as an excuse to spend time with me, but who hasn't actually declared any intentions beyond commercial partnership. What I see is a man who's been abroad for years and whose reputation is decidedly unclear. What I see is someone who's either genuinely interested or exceptionally cruel." "Cruel how?" "By making me hope again." The words came out more honest than she'd intended. "By making my family hope. We've already been humiliated once, Your Grace. I won't survive it twice." The silence stretched between them. Outside, a carriage rattled past. Somewhere in the house, Cordelia was practicing piano, the notes drifting up imperfectly. "James Kingswell is an idiot," Alexander said finally. "But you know that. What you might not know is that he's also now deeply in debt. The sterling fortune wasn't as substantial as everyone believed. Vivienne's father was brilliant at appearing wealthy. The reality is significantly less impressive." Arabella felt something cold settle in her stomach. "How do you know this?" "Because I made it my business to know. Because I wanted to understand exactly what kind of man had hurt you badly enough to make you this careful." He met her eyes. "And because I may have made certain investments that ensured several of his ventures failed." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You ruined him?" "I simply withdrew support from a man who didn't deserve success. There's a difference." He paused. "I'm telling you this not to impress you, but because I don't want secrets between us. I acted rashly, perhaps. But I'm not sorry. You don't even know me." "Why would you?" "Because the first time I saw you, you looked like I felt. Surrounded by fools, exhausted by their games, tired of pretending any of it mattered." He leaned forward. "I went to India when I was 23 because I couldn't stand one more ballroom, one more vacant conversation, one more person who cared more about my title than anything I actually thought or felt. I built railways and fought bureaucrats and made my own fortune because I refused to be just another aristocrat living off ancestral wealth and contributing nothing. And then I came back to England and found the same empty people having the same empty conversations. Except you. You were angry and hurt and absolutely refusing to pretend you weren't. It was the most honest thing I'd seen in years. Arabella's hands were shaking. She folded them in her lap. Your Grace. I'm courting you, Miss Braxton. Badly, apparently, since you seem to think I haven't made my intentions clear. I'm courting you because you're intelligent and direct and you don't bore me, which is rarer than you might think. I'm courting you because I want a partner, not an ornament. I'm courting you because when I imagine my future, I prefer you were in it. He stood. But I'm also patient. I can wait until you believe me. He left before she could respond. She sat in her father's study, surrounded by contracts and correspondence, and felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart begin to crack. The courtship that followed was unlike anything London society had ever seen. Alexander Blackwood didn't court like other men. He didn't send flowers or poetry. He didn't make pretty speeches or arrange romantic encounters. Instead, he showed up at the Braxton residence with books he thought she'd find interesting and stayed for hours debating philosophy and politics. He took her to museums and galleries, pointing out details and asking her opinion. He invited her family to dinners where the conversation was about ideas rather than gossip, where her father's trade connections were valued rather than tolerated. And slowly, carefully, Arabella began to trust him. It helped that he never pushed. When she needed space, he gave it. When she was sharp or defensive, he didn't take offense. When she tested him with difficult questions about his intentions or his past, he answered honestly, even when the honesty wasn't flattering. "Why did you leave England?" she asked one evening. They were walking through his London house. He was considering renovations and wanted her opinion, which she suspected was an excuse but appreciated nonetheless. "Because I was engaged to be married, and I realized 3 weeks before the wedding that I couldn't do it. That I'd rather die alone in a foreign country than spend my life with someone I didn't love and couldn't respect." He paused at a window overlooking the garden. Her name was Elizabeth. Beautiful, accomplished, perfect by every measure society cares about. Also vapid, cruel to servants, and interested in me only as a title and fortune. I called it off. Her family was humiliated. My family was furious. So I left. That's the scandal people whisper about. One of them. The other is that I made my fortune working, which apparently is unseemly for a duke. I was supposed to simply inherit wealth and do nothing useful with my life. He smiled without humor. I've disappointed many people. Good, Arabella said. People who are never disappointing are usually very boring. His expression softened. See? This is why I'm courting you. By summer, their courtship was the subject of intense speculation. The Duke of Ashford and the merchant's daughter. The man who'd rejected society and the girl society had rejected. Whispers followed them everywhere, but Arabella found she cared less with each passing week. Alexander had given her something unexpected, the freedom to stop performing. Around him, she didn't have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who she was. In August, he proposed. They were in her father's garden, nothing romantic or dramatic, just a quiet evening after dinner. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because I need a duchess or an heir or any of the usual reasons. Because I prefer your company to anyone else's. Because you make me think. Because when I imagine my future, you're the only person I want in it." "What about love?" she had to ask. "You said you wouldn't marry without it." "I'm not good with words like that. I never have been." He took her hands. But I will spend every day proving it to you in action instead. I will listen to you. I will value your opinions. I will give you freedom, respect, and partnership. I will never make you small to make myself feel large. I will be honest with you, even when it's uncomfortable. And I will choose you, every day, for as long as we both live. If that's not love, I don't know what is. Arabella looked at this strange, difficult, wonderful man, and felt something shift inside her. The careful defenses she'd maintained, the determined guardedness, all of it seemed suddenly exhausting. She was tired of protecting herself from joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile, rare and genuine, was worth every moment of fear. They married in September, and the wedding was exactly what they both wanted: small, meaningful, tended by people who actually cared about them rather than social obligations. Arabella's sisters wept happily. Her parents looked stunned by their good fortune. Alexander's few close friends, men he'd met in India, fellow engineers and builders, gave speeches about loyalty and partnership that made Arabella like them immediately. The wedding breakfast was held at Alexander's London house, and it was there, in a quiet moment between toasts, that he handed her an envelope. "What's this?" "Options," he said simply. Inside were legal documents, detailed financial records, and a letter, in Alexander's precise handwriting, explaining exactly what he'd done to ensure James Kingswell's failures. "I told you I'd acted rashly," he said quietly. "I meant it. I pulled investments, spread word about his poor judgment, and made certain opportunities evaporate. I did it because I was angry about what he'd done to you. But it was your pain, not mine. So you decide what happens next. I can restore some of what I took. I can do nothing. I can do more. The choice is yours." Arabella read through the documents, her heart beating fast. James Kingswell was indeed in debt, not ruined, but struggling. Vivienne had left him 3 months ago, the marriage a disaster from the start. He was living in reduced circumstances, humiliated in the same social circles that had once welcomed him. She thought about the girl she'd been a year ago. How devastated she'd been. How small he'd made her feel. She thought about how satisfying it might be to know he was suffering as she'd suffered. And then she thought about who she wanted to be. Not the wounded girl from last November, but the woman she'd become. The woman Alexander saw. The woman who'd learned that happiness wasn't about revenge but about building something better. "Do nothing more," she said finally. "He's experiencing natural consequences of his own choices. That's enough. But I also don't want to rescue him. He made his decisions. He can live with them." Alexander nodded. "Mercy tempered with justice. I like it." She looked up at him, this man who'd given her control over something most men would have kept to themselves. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "Always," he said simply. 5 years later, Arabella Blackwood, Duchess of Ashford, sat in her drawing room reviewing proposals for a new school she was funding for working-class girls. Her 2 children, Thomas, 3, and Eleanor, 1, played nearby under their nurse's watchful eye. Alexander was in the study, working on plans for a new railway line in Scotland. The butler announced a visitor. "Mrs. James Kingswell to see you, Your Grace." Arabella's hand stilled on the paper. She hadn't seen Vivienne in 5 years. Hadn't spoken to her since the betrayal. For a moment, she considered refusing the visit. Then she thought better of it. Show her in. Vivienne looked older. Thinner. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her dress, while respectable, was several seasons old. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, clearly expecting anger or rejection. "Please sit," Arabella said. "Tea? I don't deserve your hospitality." "Perhaps not. But I'm offering it anyway." She poured 2 cups. "Why are you here, Vivienne?" "I'm leaving James. Finally. The marriage has been..." She trailed off. "It's been exactly what I deserved. He married me for money that barely existed. I married him because I was stupid and jealous and convinced myself I was in love with him. We've made each other miserable. I'm sorry for that." "Don't be. You tried to be my friend. I betrayed that friendship for a man who never loved me. I've had 5 years to regret it." She met Arabella's eyes. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I'm trying to start over, and I thought... I don't know. I thought if I didn't at least try to apologize, I'd never be able to move forward." Arabella studied the woman who'd once been her best friend. She felt no anger now, no bitterness. Only a kind of sad acknowledgement of how much they'd both changed. "I forgive you," she said finally. "Not because you've earned it, but because I don't want to carry that weight anymore. You hurt me badly, Vivienne. But that was 5 years ago, and I'm not that girl anymore." Vivienne's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. However," Arabella continued, "I can't offer you friendship. Not the way it was. That trust is gone. But I can offer you resources if you need them. A letter of introduction for employment. A small loan if money is your concern. Help, but not intimacy. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But it's what I'm willing to give." They talked for another half hour, carefully, politely, like former acquaintances rather than former friends. When Vivienne left, Arabella felt lighter somehow. She'd chosen mercy again, but on her own terms. She'd helped without making herself small. She'd forgiven without forgetting. That evening, she told Alexander about the visit. He listened without interrupting, then pulled her close. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "I learned from someone who showed me that strength and kindness aren't opposites. I didn't teach you that. You already knew it. You just needed space to remember." Arabella looked around her drawing room, at the children playing, at the proposals for the school that would help dozens of girls, at the life she'd built with this difficult, wonderful man. She thought about the girl she'd been, dreaming of orange blossoms and a very different future. And she thought about how sometimes the worst betrayals led to the most unexpected gifts. "I'm glad he didn't marry me," she said suddenly. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a development." "I mean it. If James had married me, I'd have been moderately happy, I suppose. Comfortable. Respectable. But I wouldn't have been this. I wouldn't have built anything. I wouldn't have met you. I wouldn't have learned that I'm capable of more than I imagined." She smiled. "So yes. I'm glad he broke my heart. It made room for something better. Should I be concerned that my wife is grateful for heartbreak? Your wife is grateful for perspective. There's a difference." He kissed her forehead. "Well then. Let's be grateful together." And there, in the drawing room of their London house, with their children playing nearby and their future spread out before them like an unwritten book, Arabella Blackwood decided that some stories really did have happy endings. Just not the ones you expected when you were young and foolish and dreaming of orange blossoms. The best ones came after you'd learned what you were really made of. After you've been broken and rebuilt yourself stronger. After you'd stopped waiting for rescue and realized you were capable of saving yourself. Those endings were worth every moment of pain that came before them. James Kingswell represents everyone who uses and discards people for profit. But people like him only win when we stay silent. If you believe Arabella deserved better, hit like to stand against betrayal, comment what you'd have done, and subscribe for more stories of women who choose themselves.